The fire inside. Darrell Malone had always believed in second chances, though he never imagined how much his own life would change because of one. At 35, Darrell had settled into a routine that brought him a sense of peace. He lived alone in a modest two-bedroom house on the outskirts of a small town, a far cry from the chaotic, flame-filled world he once inhabited as a firefighter. Now, Darrell was a mechanic, and his days were filled with fixing cars, greasing engines, and enjoying the relative quiet his new profession offered. Yet, beneath that calm exterior, there was a fire that still burned inside him, one he had been trying to extinguish for years. Darrell wasn't always a mechanic. Not long ago, he wore a uniform that demanded courage and quick thinking. His name was well known in the local fire department, respected for his ability to keep his cool under pressure. But that was before the accident, before a routine call turned his world upside down and left him questioning everything he thought he knew about himself. The incident had been the defining moment of his life, though Darrell wished it hadn't been. He still remembered that day with excruciating clarity. It was supposed to be a straightforward call, a fire in an old apartment building on the west side of town. Darrell and his team arrived just minutes after the alarm rang, and from the outside, it looked like they had the situation under control. Smoke billowed from the windows, but the flames weren't too advanced yet. Darrell, ever the brave soul, volunteered to go in. He was told there was a child trapped on the 4th floor, a little boy. Without hesitation, Darrell donned his gear and raced into the building. The heat hit him like a wall as soon as he stepped inside, and the smoke was so thick it felt like he was breathing through a wet blanket. But Darrell had been through this before. He trusted his training, trusted his instincts. By the time he reached the 4th floor, the flames had intensified, licking up the walls and consuming everything in their path. Still, Darrell pressed on. The boy was hiding in a corner, terrified, clutching a small stuffed animal as though it could shield him from the inferno. Darrell scooped him up in one swift motion, cradling the boy in his arms as he began the descent back through the fiery maze. But then, everything changed. As he neared the stairwell, a support beam, weakened by the fire, gave way above him. Darrell heard the creak before he saw it, just enough time to push the boy forward, out of harm's way, before the beam crashed down onto his leg. The pain was instant, white-hot, and paralyzing, but Darrell didn't let go of the boy. With sheer determination, he dragged himself and the child down the last few flights of stairs and out into the fresh air. The child was safe, but Darrell's leg was shattered, and so was something inside him. The physical injuries healed over time. After months of rehabilitation, he was able to walk again, albeit with a slight limp that served as a constant reminder of that day. But the emotional scars were deeper, harder to mend. The nightmares started soon after. Every time Darrell closed his eyes, he was back in that burning building, feeling the searing heat and hearing the screams of a child. He woke up drenched in sweat, heart racing, unable to shake the fear that next time, someone wouldn't make it out. That fear haunted him, consuming his thoughts until he couldn't bear to continue as a firefighter. He had to walk away. It was the hardest decision he ever made, leaving behind the job he loved, the one that gave him purpose. But he couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't face the flames, couldn't face the risk of failure. So, Darrell turned to cars. Working as a mechanic allowed him to stay grounded, to focus on something tangible. Cars were predictable. They broke down, but they could be fixed. If an engine didn't run, Darrell could tinker with it, adjust a few things, and make it work again. It was a far cry from the unpredictability of fires. And that was exactly what Darrell needed: control, routine, safety. But even in the small town where Darrell now lived, peace was a fragile thing. Tensions simmered just beneath the surface, especially between the black community and the police force. It was an unspoken divide, but it was always there, visible in the sidelong glances people gave him when he walked down the street, or in the way conversations would abruptly stop when he entered a room. Darrell had always been good at keeping his head down, avoiding trouble, but that didn't make the tension any less real. He saw it every day. And of all the police officers in town, one man stood out: Officer Bradley, a tall, square-jawed cop with a reputation for being hard but fair, at least according to some. To others, especially in Daryl's community, Bradley was something else entirely. He was tough, uncompromising, and more often than not, his version of the law seemed to come down harder on people who looked like Daryl. Daryl had never had a run-in with Bradley himself, but he'd heard the stories. Bradley was the kind of cop who believed in law and order, no exceptions, and while that might have worked for some, for others, it felt like oppression. The unwritten rules of the town were clear, and Daryl had done his best to live by them, staying out of the spotlight, keeping his interactions with the police to a minimum. But even in a quiet town like this, life had a way of throwing unexpected challenges in your path. One night, as Daryl was driving home from the garage after a long day, he encountered something that would change his life forever. The road was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. Daryl liked these moments, the quiet of the evening, the rhythmic hum of the engine, the world slowly winding down for the night. But then, out of nowhere, a car sped past him, veering wildly across the road. Daryl barely had time to register what was happening before the car smashed through the guardrail and plummeted down an embankment. For a moment, everything was silent, and then came the explosion. Daryl's heart jumped into his throat. Without thinking, he slammed on the brakes, his truck screeching to a halt on the side of the road. His instincts kicked in, years of training rushing back in an instant. Before he even knew what he was doing, Daryl was running toward the wreckage, his pulse pounding in his ears. Flames were already licking at the hood of the car, the acrid smell of burning fuel thick in the air. And then he saw it, the outline of a man slumped over the steering wheel. Daryl didn't need to get closer to recognize the uniform. It was a police officer. The flames were rising higher, and the car could explode at any second. Every fiber of Daryl's being told him to stop, to turn around, and get as far away from the fire as possible. The nightmares flashed in his mind, the heat, the fear, the screams. But he couldn't just leave the man to die. Not again. With his heart racing and every instinct screaming at him to run, Daryl made the decision that would change everything. The fire inside him had returned, and this time he wasn't running from it. After the fire. As the fire raged behind him, Daryl's breath came in heavy, labored gasps. He could barely hear his own heartbeat over the roar of the flames, but every second counted. His leg ached, a sharp pain shooting up his thigh from where he'd strained it pulling the officer from the wreckage. Still, he didn't have time to think about himself. All that mattered was getting away from the car before it exploded again. Daryl dragged Officer Bradley up the steep embankment, his arms burning with the effort. Bradley was heavy, unconscious, and limp, a dead weight in Daryl's grasp. The flames crept closer, their glow illuminating the scene in a flickering orange hue, but Daryl was determined to reach the top of the hill before the car turned into a fireball. Step by step, he pushed through the pain, his breaths shallow and fast. He knew the police cruiser could go up at any second, but something deep inside him, something buried beneath the years of fear and self-doubt, kept him moving. He'd done this before. He could do it again. He had to. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daryl reached the top of the embankment. The cool night air hit his face like a splash of cold water. He collapsed onto the grass, pulling Bradley beside him, and for a moment just lay there, staring up at the sky as his lungs screamed for air. The car erupted behind them with a deafening boom, and a plume of fire shot into the night. Daryl shielded his face from the heat, feeling the wave of warmth wash over him. He turned his head slightly and glanced at Bradley, who was still unconscious but breathing. The faint rise and fall of the officer's chest gave Daryl a small sense of relief. It was only then, as he lay on the side of the road, that Daryl realized who the officer was. Bradley. He whispered under his breath, his voice hoarse from the smoke. Officer Bradley, the man who had become almost a legend in the town, a symbol of authority, discipline, and, for many, oppression. Darrell had never interacted with him directly, but he knew the stories, just like everyone else. Bradley was known for being tough on crime, but many in the black community saw his actions as something more sinister. He was the cop who pulled people over for driving while black, the one who seemed to always be at the center of every questionable traffic stop, every tense moment between the police and the community. Now, here he was, this larger-than-life figure, unconscious and helpless in Darrell's care. Darrell stared at the officer, the flickering flames of the burning car casting eerie shadows across Bradley's face. For a brief moment, Darrell considered what might have happened if he hadn't been there. What if he hadn't pulled Bradley from the wreckage? Would anyone have cared? Would Bradley have done the same for him if the roles were reversed? It was a bitter thought, and Darrell pushed it away as quickly as it came. He didn't save Bradley because of who he was. He did it because it was the right thing to do. Because that's who Darrell was, even if he hadn't always believed it. The sound of approaching sirens broke the stillness of the night. Help was coming. Paramedics, firefighters, other police officers. They would be there any minute, but Darrell had no intention of sticking around for questions. He'd done his part, saved a life, and now all he wanted was to go home, to slip back into the quiet life he built for himself. He stood, wincing as his leg protested, and looked down at Bradley one last time. The officer was starting to stir, his eyes fluttering open as he groaned in pain. Darrell hesitated. He could stay, explain what had happened, be the hero in the story. But something about that idea didn't sit right with him. No, this wasn't about being the hero. Darrell wasn't looking for recognition or praise. He just wanted to live his life in peace. Without another word, Darrell turned and limped back toward his truck. The night air was cool against his skin, but the heat of the fire still clung to him, mixing with the sweat and grime on his body. He climbed into his truck, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. For a long moment, he sat there, staring at the road ahead, trying to process what had just happened. The wail of sirens grew louder as emergency vehicles sped toward the wreckage. Darrell took a deep breath, started the engine, and pulled away from the scene. He didn't look back. The next morning, Darrell woke with a dull ache in his leg, a reminder of the previous night's events. The pain was manageable, though, nothing compared to what he'd endured after the fire that had ended his career as a firefighter. He limped into the kitchen, made himself a cup of coffee, and stared out the window at the quiet street in front of his house. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe that everything would go back to normal. That the fire, the rescue, Officer Bradley, none of it would matter in the grand scheme of things. He could just go to work, fix some cars, and return to his routine. But deep down, Darrell knew that wasn't true. The phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. He glanced at the clock. It was just past 8 a.m., too early for a call from anyone who wasn't family or work. Frowning, Darrell set down his coffee and picked up the receiver. "Hello, Mr. Malone." The voice on the other end was official, stern, but not unkind. "This is Sergeant Harris with the town's police department. I'm calling in regards to an incident last night." Darrell's heart skipped a beat. There was a serious car accident on Route 15 involving one of our officers, Officer Bradley. He's in the hospital now, stable but recovering from some significant injuries. Darrell didn't say anything. His grip tightened on the phone as he waited for what was coming next. "We have reason to believe that you were at the scene. Witnesses reported seeing your truck nearby, and from what we can tell, it seems like you might have been the one who pulled Officer Bradley from the wreckage." Darrell's mind raced. Of course, someone had seen him. The road wasn't as deserted as he'd thought. He cursed under his breath, wishing he'd been more careful, wishing he'd left sooner. I didn't think anyone saw me," Darrell finally said, his voice low. Sergeant Harris paused for a moment before speaking again. "We understand that you might not want attention, Mr. Malone, but I think you should know you saved his life. If you hadn't been there, Officer Bradley wouldn't have made it. He's asking to see you." Darrell blinked in surprise. "He is?" "Yes, he's still in and out of consciousness, but he's been asking for the man who pulled him from the car. He doesn't remember much, but he remembers you." Darrell didn't know what to say. The idea of sitting face to face with Officer Bradley, of all people, was the last thing he wanted. What could they possibly have to say to each other? "I don't think that's necessary," Darrell said, his voice tight. "I was just doing what anyone would have done." "Not anyone would have done what you did," Harris replied. There was a weight to his words, a seriousness that made Darrell's stomach tighten. "Officer Bradley owes you his life. I think it would mean a lot to him to meet you, to thank you in person." Darrell hesitated, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. Everything in him screamed to decline, to walk away and keep his distance. He had done his part. He didn't want anything more to do with the situation. But at the same time, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was something more than a simple rescue. Maybe this was part of the second chance he'd been avoiding for so long. "I'll think about it," Darrell finally said. Sergeant Harris thanked him and hung up, leaving Darrell standing in the kitchen, the phone still clutched in his hand. He stared at it for a long time, the events of the previous night replaying in his mind. What was it about this moment, this rescue, that felt so different? Why couldn't he shake the feeling that everything in his life had just shifted? Darrell set the phone down and looked out the window again. The quiet street seemed unchanged, but inside, Darrell knew that something had begun, something he wasn't sure he was ready for. A life-changing meeting. The day was gray and overcast, as if the sky itself reflected the weight of Darrell's thoughts. He sat in his truck outside the hospital, the engine idling softly beneath him. The radio played low in the background, but he wasn't listening to the words. His mind was elsewhere, tangled up in the events of the past few days. It had been 2 days since the accident. 2 days since Darrell had pulled Officer Bradley from that burning car and walked away from the scene, determined to forget it ever happened. But forgetting was impossible now. The police department had called again and again, until finally Darrell had agreed to come to the hospital. Not because he wanted to, but because something inside him, some nagging sense of unfinished business, compelled him to face what he had been avoiding. Darrell wasn't sure what to expect. He didn't know how Officer Bradley would react to seeing him, didn't know what kind of conversation they would have. Would Bradley be grateful, embarrassed, angry? The idea of confronting the man, of looking him in the eye, filled Darrell with a mix of dread and curiosity. He sighed heavily, then reached for the keys and turned off the engine. The hospital loomed in front of him, a sterile building of concrete and glass, cold and impersonal. He hated hospitals. Too many memories, too much loss. Climbing out of the truck, Darrell stretched his leg, wincing as the ache in his thigh reminded him of the strain he put it under during the rescue. The pain was manageable, though, just a dull throb that faded as he began walking toward the entrance. As he entered the sliding doors, the scent of disinfectant hit him, sharp and clinical, instantly putting him on edge. The receptionist at the front desk greeted him with a polite smile, her hands tapping away at the keyboard. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Officer Bradley," Darrell said, his voice gruff. The woman nodded, her fingers moving quickly over the keys. "Ah, yes. He's in room 208, second floor. Just take the elevator on your left and follow the signs. His family has already been by today, but he's still awake." "Thanks," Darrell muttered, heading toward the elevator. The pit in his stomach grew heavier with each step. When the elevator doors slid open on the second floor, Darrell stepped into the hushed hallway, his footsteps muffled by the thick linoleum. Hospital staff moved silently around him, doctors and nurses attending to patients with quiet efficiency. As he made his way down the corridor, he felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were walking through a dream, a scenario too surreal to be real. He finally reached room 208, hesitating outside the door. His hand hovered over the handle for a moment, uncertainty gripping him. Did he really want to do this? Was it necessary? Before he could talk himself out of it, the door opened from the inside. A nurse, middle-aged and tired-looking, stepped out, her gaze briefly meeting his. "Are you Mr. Malone?" she asked, eyeing him carefully. Darrell nodded. "He's awake. He's been asking for you," the nurse said softly. He's grateful. Just go easy on him. He's still in a lot of pain." Darrell didn't respond, just gave a curt nod and stepped past her into the room. His heart pounded in his chest as he took in the sight of Officer Bradley lying in the hospital bed. Bradley looked different than Darrell expected. The strong, intimidating figure of authority that Darrell had always associated with the officer was gone, replaced by a man who seemed smaller, vulnerable. Bradley's face was pale, his head bandaged, and there were dark circles under his eyes. His arm was in a sling, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. But when he saw Darrell, his eyes lit up with recognition. "You?" Bradley's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "You're the one who saved me." Darrell nodded stiffly, unsure of what to say. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence hung between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Bradley struggled to sit up a little straighter, wincing as he adjusted his position in the bed. I don't know how to thank you," Bradley finally said, his voice cracking with the effort. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." Darrell shifted awkwardly on his feet, not knowing how to respond. He hadn't come for gratitude. He wasn't sure why he had come at all. "Really, I just did what anyone would have done," he muttered, his voice low. Bradley shook his head weakly. No, not everyone would have done that. Especially not for me." Darrell felt a knot tighten in his chest at those words. He knew what Bradley was implying. The unspoken history between them, between men like him and men like Bradley. The tension that had always simmered beneath the surface of their interactions. The quiet distrust that ran deep in towns like theirs. "Why?" Bradley asked, his voice barely audible. "Why did you save me? After everything. After all the times I must have seemed like." Darrell's jaw tightened. He didn't want to have this conversation. He didn't want to dig into the layers of resentment and suspicion that had defined their lives for so long. But here they were, face to face, with no more barriers between them. "I didn't save you because of who you are," Darrell said bluntly, his voice hard. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. That's it." Bradley stared at him, his eyes filled with something Darrell couldn't quite place. Regret. Shame. Guilt. "I've made mistakes," Bradley said softly. "More than I care to admit. I'm not proud of everything I've done as a cop. I know that people like you, don't trust me, don't trust the badge, and I understand why. I do. But that night, when I was in that car, I thought I was going to die." Darrell swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had thought Bradley might die too, in those terrifying moments when the flames had been closing in, when the weight of the officer's limp body had almost been too much to bear. But he hadn't let that stop him. He had pushed through the fear, just like he had once done as a firefighter, because he couldn't stand by and let someone die. Not again. "I'm not here to judge you, Bradley," Darrell said finally, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "But things aren't easy for people like me in this town, and you know that. You've been a part of it, whether you meant to be or not." Bradley's eyes flickered with something. Understanding, maybe. Pain. "I know," he whispered. "I know." Silence settled over the room again, but this time it wasn't quite as heavy. Something had shifted between them, something neither of them could fully explain. Darrell wasn't sure if it was forgiveness or acceptance or just the simple fact that they had both survived that night and were now left to reckon with the consequences. Bradley took a deep breath, wincing slightly as he moved. "I don't know how to fix things, Darrell. I don't know how to change the way people see me, see the police. But I want to try. I owe you that much." Darrell raised an eyebrow, surprised by the vulnerability in Bradley's words. This wasn't the tough, stoic officer he had heard about. This was a man, broken and humbled by the reality of his own mortality. "I'm not asking you to fix anything," Darrell said, his tone softer now. "Just, maybe start seeing people for who they are, not for what you expect them to be." Bradley nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'll try. I will." Darrell stood there for a moment longer, feeling the weight of everything that had been said, and everything that hadn't. It wasn't much, this exchange between them, but it felt like a step in the right direction. A step towards something better, something more human. Without another word, Darrell turned to leave, his leg aching as he walked toward the door. "Darrell," Bradley called after him, his voice trembling slightly. Darrell stopped and looked back. "Thank you," Bradley said again, his voice filled with sincerity. Darrell nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, before stepping out of the room and closing the door behind him. As he walked through the hospital corridors, Darrell felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had finally been lifted. He didn't know what would happen next, whether things would change between him and Bradley, or whether the town itself would shift in some small, imperceptible way. But for the first time in a long time, Darrell felt like he had taken control of his own story. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Ripples through the town. Darrell thought that after his visit to the hospital, things would settle down. He expected to return to the relative calm of his life, fixing cars and minding his own business, just as he always had. But life had other plans, plans that Darrell wasn't prepared for. The morning after his encounter with Officer Bradley, Darrell walked into his garage to find a small crowd gathered outside. At first, he thought maybe there was an accident or a fire nearby, but as he stepped closer, he realized they were waiting for him. The sight made him stop in his tracks. Reporters, cameramen, microphones in hand, eager expressions on their faces. A handful of locals stood with them, whispering and pointing in his direction. Darrell's heart sank. He had no idea how word had spread so quickly, but it was clear that the story of him saving Officer Bradley had made its way to the media. And now, they were here for him. His first instinct was to turn around, get back in his truck, and drive away. But he couldn't run forever. Steeling himself, he straightened his shoulders and walked toward the crowd, trying to ignore the pit of unease in his stomach. As soon as they saw him, the reporters swarmed, bombarding him with questions. "Mr. Malone, can you tell us how you managed to pull Officer Bradley from the wreckage?" "Darrell, what was going through your mind when you saw the car on fire? Did you know it was Officer Bradley when you rescued him? How do you feel about saving the life of a police officer, given the racial tensions in this town?" The questions came rapid fire, one after another, barely giving Darrell time to process what was being asked. He blinked, feeling overwhelmed. He had never been one for the spotlight, never liked being the center of attention. And now here he was, thrust into it against his will. He opened his mouth to speak, but found that the words wouldn't come. What was there to say? He had done what he thought was right in the moment. He hadn't asked for this attention, and he certainly didn't want to be paraded around as some kind of hero. "I don't." Darrell started, then stopped, his voice trailing off. Suddenly, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Back off. Give the man some space." Darrell turned to see a tall, thin figure stepping between him and the reporters, her arms outstretched to create a barrier between them. It was Jessica, his best friend since high school and the only person in town who seemed to understand him. She shot him a look, her eyes flashing with concern. "You all right?" Darrell nodded, though he wasn't sure if he really was. "I didn't expect this." Jessica turned to face the reporters, her voice firm and authoritative. "Darrell isn't interested in giving interviews right now. He's a private person, and you need to respect that. If you want to ask him questions, you can do it through proper channels, but for now, please leave." There was a murmur of protest from the crowd, but after a few moments, they began to disperse, some of them grumbling under their breath. Darryl watched them go, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. He knew they'd be back, that this wasn't over. The story was out there now, and it would only grow. Once the crowd had cleared, Jessica turned back to him. "What the hell, Darryl? When were you gonna tell me about all this?" Darryl sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I wasn't. I didn't think it would blow up like this." Jessica crossed her arms, giving him a knowing look. "You saved a cop's life in a town where the police and the black community have been at odds for years. Of course, it was going to blow up." Darryl shook his head. "I didn't do it for attention, Jess. I couldn't let him die." "I know," she said softly. "And that's why people are going to make a big deal out of this. Because it's complicated. You saved someone who represents everything that's been wrong for people like us in this town. But you did it anyway." Darryl leaned against the side of his truck, exhaustion washing over him. "I don't want to be part of that narrative. I don't want to be some symbol for whatever people think this means." Jessica nodded. "I get it. But you might not have a choice. The story is out now, and people are gonna spin it however they want. You need to figure out how you want to handle this, or it's gonna handle you." Darryl sighed again, rubbing his temples. He could feel a headache coming on. "What should I do?" Jessica was quiet for a moment, thinking. "You could talk to them. Set the record straight. Or you could keep doing what you've been doing and hope it blows over. But either way, you need to be ready for what's coming next." Darryl didn't like either option. He didn't want to become the face of a story he hadn't asked for. He didn't want to be dragged into the politics of race and policing in a town that had been divided for as long as he could remember. But he also knew that ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. "I'll think about it," he said finally. I need some time." Jessica patted him on the shoulder. "Take all the time you need. But don't wait too long. People are watching now." Over the next few days, the story spread like wildfire. Local news outlets ran with the narrative of a black man saving a white cop, framing it as a story of unity in a divided town. Headlines like "Heroic Act Bridges Racial Divide" and "Mechanics' Bravery Sparks Hope in Small Town" appeared on every news station, in every newspaper. Soon, it wasn't just local news. It went national. Darryl's face was plastered on screens across the country, his name mentioned in stories that he had no control over. The media painted him as a hero, a man who had risen above the tensions between the black community and the police to save a life. But not everyone saw it that way. Some members of the black community were less than thrilled with how the story was being spun. They didn't see Darryl as a hero. They saw him as someone who had put his life on the line for a man who had represented oppression. The whispers started quietly, then grew louder. "He's being used. They're turning him into a poster boy for all lives matter. Why save a man like Bradley? Why not let him burn?" The words stung, even though Darryl tried to block them out. He understood where the anger was coming from. He knew the pain that people in his community had felt for generations, the way they had been treated by men like Bradley. But what was he supposed to do? Let the man die just because he wore a uniform? On the other side, the police department was also grappling with the fallout. Bradley had been discharged from the hospital, and his recovery was slow, but steady. He had tried to reach out to Darryl several times, but Darryl had avoided him. He wasn't ready for that conversation. Not again. The police, too, were walking a fine line. They praised Darryl publicly, calling him a hero, but internally, there was tension. Some officers didn't like the idea of Bradley being saved by someone from the community they had been trained to see as a potential threat. Others were uncomfortable with how the story had put a spotlight on the strained relationship between the police and the black residents of the town. And then there were the outsiders. Activists, commentators, politicians who saw Darryl's story as an opportunity to push their own agendas. Some hailed him as a symbol of hope, a man who had transcended race and violence to save a life. Others saw him as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how deeply ingrained the divisions in society were. Daryl felt like he was being pulled in a dozen different directions, none of them his own. Everyone wanted him to be something he wasn't. A hero, a martyr, a symbol. But all he wanted was to go back to his simple life, to fix cars and stay out of the limelight. One evening, a week after the accident, Daryl sat in his small kitchen, staring at his phone. It had been ringing nonstop for days. Reporters, strangers, even some distant relatives who had heard about the story and wanted to reconnect. He had ignored most of the calls, but there was one number that kept showing up over and over again. Officer Bradley. Daryl knew he couldn't avoid the man forever. Sooner or later, they would have to have a real conversation. But he wasn't ready for that. Not yet. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text message. It was from Jessica. "We need to talk. Meet me at the diner in an hour. It's important." Daryl frowned, his curiosity piqued. Jessica rarely used the word important unless she really meant it. He sent her a quick reply, then grabbed his jacket and keys. The diner was quiet when Daryl walked in, the familiar smell of frying bacon and coffee greeting him as he entered. Jessica was already sitting in their usual booth at the back, a cup of coffee in front of her. She looked up as he approached, her expression serious. "What's going on?" Daryl asked as he slid into the seat. "Decisions and divides." Daryl slid into the booth across from Jessica, his body tense with anticipation. The low hum of conversation filled the diner, but to him, it was just background noise. Something in Jessica's expression, intense, focused, told him that whatever she had to say wasn't going to be easy to hear. Jessica pushed a cup of coffee toward him, but Daryl ignored it, leaning forward instead. "All right, Jess. What's this about?" She sighed, her fingers tracing the rim of her own cup. "I didn't want to get into this here, but you've been dodging me all week, and I figured this was the only way to pin you down. We got a problem, Daryl." "We?" Daryl asked, eyebrows raised. Jessica nodded. "Yeah, we. Because this situation isn't just about you anymore. The town's talking, and not just the media. There's been a lot of back and forth, especially in our community. People are split." Daryl felt his stomach tighten. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from Jessica made it real. He didn't need to ask her to elaborate. He already knew what she meant. Some people saw him as a hero, a man who had done the right thing. Others, though, saw his actions as a betrayal. He rubbed the back of his neck, the weight of it all pressing down on him. "I didn't ask for this, Jess. I didn't want any of it." "I know you didn't," Jessica said gently. "But it's here now, whether you want it or not. People are watching you. They're looking to you for answers. And you can't just pretend it'll go away if you ignore it long enough." Daryl frowned. "What do they want from me? I'm just a guy who fixes cars, for God's sake. I'm not some spokesperson." Jessica's gaze softened. "No, but like it or not, people are holding you up as a symbol. A symbol of hope, a symbol of division, depending on who you ask. You saved Bradley's life. Some folks see that as an act of courage, of bridging the gap between the black community and the police. Others, well, they think you should have let him burn." Daryl's jaw clenched at those last words. "You think I should have?" Jessica's eyes widened in surprise. "Of course not. I'm not saying I agree with them, but I get why they're angry. Bradley represents everything that's wrong with this town to a lot of people. The way cops like him have treated us, the way they've looked at us like we're criminals just for existing. You saved the guy who's been part of that system." Daryl leaned back in his seat, letting out a long breath. "I wasn't thinking about any of that. I saw a man about to die, and I did what I had to do." "I know," Jessica said, her voice steady. "But people aren't seeing it that way. It's become about more than just you and Bradley. This town's been sitting on a powder keg for years, and now it feels like you've lit the fuse." Daryl could feel the tension rising in his chest. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't an activist. He was just a man who had acted on instinct, and now the world was turning his actions into something they weren't. So, what am I supposed to do, Jess? Just lay low and hope it blows over. Jessica shook her head. It won't blow over. That's the thing. There's too much history here, too many wounds that haven't healed. You need to figure out where you stand in all of this. You can't stay neutral. Neutral? Daryl scoffed. I'm not trying to take a side. Well, it's being decided for you, she said, her tone sharp. The police are calling you a hero, and they're using that to paint themselves in a better light. But then you've got people in the black community who feel like you've been co-opted by them. They feel betrayed, Daryl. The question is, how do you want to handle it? Daryl stared down at the table, his mind spinning. He wasn't naive. He knew that tensions between the black community and the police in their town had been simmering for years. He'd experienced it firsthand. Pulled over for no reason, questioned like he was a suspect even when he hadn't done anything wrong. He understood the anger, the distrust. But that night by the highway, it hadn't been about any of that. I didn't save Bradley because he's a cop, Daryl said quietly. I saved him because he's a person. Doesn't that mean something? Jessica sighed, her expression softening again. Of course it does. But it's not that simple. To some people, Bradley's not just a person. He's the embodiment of the system that's oppressed them. And by saving him, some folks see that as siding with that system. Daryl rubbed his hands over his face, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him. So what do you want me to do, Jess? Go out there and tell people what? That I didn't do it for the police. That I don't care about the politics. She leaned forward, her eyes locking with his. No, I'm saying you need to be honest with yourself. You didn't do it for the cops, but you also didn't do it for the community. You did it because it was the right thing to do. You can tell people that, but you also have to be ready for the fact that not everyone's going to understand or accept that. Daryl's mind flashed back to the hospital, to Bradley's broken figure lying in that bed, struggling to understand why Daryl had saved him. He remembered the way Bradley had looked at him, filled with regret and confusion, and for the first time, he wondered if maybe Bradley had been right. Maybe the lines between who they were as individuals and who they represented were too blurred. Daryl, Jessica said softly, bringing him back to the present. There's something else. The mayor's office reached out to me. His eyes snapped up to hers, suspicion clouding his features. What? Why? They want you to speak at a press conference, Jessica explained, her tone cautious. The mayor's hoping to use this moment to show that the town is healing, that we can come together despite everything that's happened. He's basically banking on your story as proof that things are getting better. Daryl felt his blood run cold. They want me to be part of their PR campaign. Jessica nodded. Pretty much. They're calling it a unity event. A way to show that we can move forward. But we both know that's not how things work. Anger flared in Daryl's chest. He wasn't some pawn to be used in a political game. He wasn't interested in being the poster child for a false narrative of reconciliation. He knew that one act of heroism wasn't going to fix decades of mistrust and inequality. I'm not doing it, he said firmly, shaking his head. I'm not standing up there and pretending like everything's fine, just because I pulled a cop out of a car. Jessica watched him for a moment, her gaze unreadable. I figured you'd say that. But I also think you should consider what your silence means too. If you don't speak, they'll speak for you. And you won't be able to control what they say. Daryl leaned back, feeling trapped. He didn't want to be used by anyone, the police, the media, or the politicians. But he also didn't want his silence to be twisted into something it wasn't. It seemed like no matter what he did, someone would be disappointed or angry or betrayed. What would you do if you were me? He asked, looking Jessica in the eye. Jessica leaned back, exhaling slowly. If it were me, I'd probably do the same thing you're doing. Want to run the other way and avoid all of this. But that's not an option for you anymore. People are watching. They're going to keep watching, whether you like it or not. So, if I were you, I'd take control of the story. I'd tell them the truth, your truth. Let them know who you really are, not who they're trying to make you out to be. Daryl didn't respond right away. He looked down at his hands, rough and calloused from years of working with engines, and felt the weight of the decision before him. Could he really do it? Could he stand in front of all those people and speak his truth, knowing that no matter what he said, someone would be hurt or disappointed? But as he sat there, a quiet realization began to settle over him. Maybe Jessica was right. Maybe the only way forward was to confront the storm head-on. He couldn't control how people felt or what they thought, but he could at least control his own voice. And that was something. "I'll think about it," he said finally, looking up at her. Jessica smiled, relief washing over her features. "That's all I ask." The following days were a whirlwind. The pressure on Daryl continued to mount, with more phone calls, more reporters, and even a few local politicians stopping by the garage, trying to convince him to attend the mayor's press conference. Daryl avoided them all, focusing on his work, trying to keep his head down. But the decision weighed on him. A turning point. Daryl was no stranger to stress, but the weight on his shoulders now felt like a boulder he could barely lift. His mind was a constant storm, torn between the growing demands from the outside world and his own instinct to withdraw. Every time his phone buzzed, it felt like another piece of his freedom slipping away. He kept the garage doors closed, pretending the world outside didn't exist. But the world had a way of breaking in. It was late afternoon when the garage bell rang, piercing through the quiet hum of tools and engines. Daryl had almost expected it. Another journalist, another town official with an agenda. He wiped the grease from his hands and headed toward the front, bracing himself for whatever came next. When he opened the door, he was met with an unexpected sight. Officer Bradley stood there, his face pale but determined. His arm was still in a sling from the accident, and there were faint bruises around his eyes. But he looked better than Daryl had imagined. For a moment, neither man spoke. Daryl felt his chest tighten, a mix of emotions swirling in his gut. Anger, confusion, even a bit of guilt. He had been avoiding this moment for days, but now there was no escape. "Bradley," Daryl muttered, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Malone," Bradley replied, his voice just as strained. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the tension. I've been trying to reach you. Didn't think showing up like this was the best idea, but I didn't know what else to do." Daryl sighed, wiping his hands on a rag. "I've been busy." "I get it," Bradley said, though his tone suggested he understood all too well why Daryl hadn't returned his calls. "But we need to talk. Face to face. I owe you that." Daryl hesitated, glancing back at the half-finished car on the lift. Part of him wanted to turn Bradley away, to send him packing like the reporters and town officials who had knocked on his door. But another part of him, the part that had pulled Bradley out of that burning car, knew that this conversation had been inevitable from the moment he made the decision to act. Without a word, Daryl stepped aside, motioning for Bradley to come in. The officer gave a grateful nod and stepped into the garage, his movements stiff with the lingering pain from his injuries. The two men stood in silence for a moment, the smell of oil and metal filling the space between them. It was Daryl who finally broke the silence. "What do you want, Bradley?" His voice was firm but not unkind. He wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. Bradley shifted on his feet, his gaze dropping to the floor before meeting Daryl's eyes again. "I want to thank you." Daryl's brow furrowed. "You already did that. Back at the hospital. We don't need to do this again." "I didn't say it properly," Bradley replied, his voice rough. "I was in shock, and I didn't know what to say. Hell, I still don't know what to say, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try." Daryl crossed his arms, his expression guarded. "You don't owe me anything, Bradley." "That's where you're wrong." Bradley's voice had a sharp edge to it now, but it wasn't anger. It was guilt. You saved my life. And not just that. You saved me when I didn't deserve it. After everything that's happened in this town, everything my department's done. I know you had every reason to leave me in that car, but you didn't. Daryl felt a flicker of irritation rise in his chest. I didn't do it for you. I didn't even know it was you until after I got you out. I know, Bradley said, his gaze steady. But you still did it, and now I have to live with that. Daryl frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Bradley let out a heavy breath, running his good hand through his hair. It means I've spent the last week thinking about a lot of things I didn't want to think about. About who I am, about what it means to wear that badge in this town, and about what I've been blind to for a long time. There was a rawness in Bradley's voice that took Daryl by surprise. He had expected Bradley to come here out of obligation, to say his thank yous, and then leave. But this was something different. This was deeper. I'm not here to defend the department, Bradley continued. I'm not here to pretend like we haven't made mistakes. Hell, I've made more than my share. But that night, when you pulled me out of that wreck, I realized I'd been living in a bubble. I'd been telling myself that what we were doing was right, that we were protecting people. But maybe we were protecting the wrong people. Daryl stared at him, unsure of what to say. He hadn't expected this kind of self-reflection from Bradley. In fact, he hadn't expected anything at all. But now, standing there, hearing the man wrestle with his own demons, Daryl felt something shift inside him. Why are you telling me this? Daryl asked, his voice low. Bradley took a deep breath, meeting Daryl's gaze with a seriousness that couldn't be ignored. Because you're the one who made me see it. You didn't just save my life that night. You forced me to look at my own. And I don't know what to do with that. But I do know that I can't go back to the way things were. Daryl didn't respond right away. He felt the weight of Bradley's words hanging in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. There was a part of him that wanted to believe Bradley was sincere, that maybe this near-death experience had shaken something loose inside the man. But another part of him, the part that had spent years watching men like Bradley pull people like him over for no reason, remained skeptical. You're saying all the right things, Daryl said finally. But words don't mean much in a town like this. I know that, Bradley replied quickly. That's why I want to do something. I don't know what yet, but I want to make things right. Or at least try to. Daryl's eyes narrowed slightly. And how do you plan on doing that? Bradley hesitated, glancing down at the floor. I don't know. But I know it starts with listening. Really listening, not just going through the motions. I want to understand what it's been like for you. For people like you, dealing with guys like me. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I'm asking for a chance to make things better. Daryl's mind raced. He could hear the sincerity in Bradley's voice, but there was something unsettling about the whole situation. The idea that Bradley had suddenly seen the light after being pulled from the wreckage felt too convenient. And yet, Daryl couldn't ignore the fact that this was a man who was at least trying to change, trying to confront the ugliness in himself. Look, man, Daryl said, his tone cautious. I don't know what to tell you. I didn't pull you out of that car expecting anything in return. I did it because it was the right thing to do, because that's who I am. But if you're serious about wanting to make things right, you're gonna have to prove it. Not to me, to the people in this town. Bradley nodded, his expression solemn. I know, and I'm willing to do that. But I can't do it alone. I need help. Daryl stared at him, caught off guard by the request. You're asking me to help you. Bradley didn't flinch. I'm asking you to be part of the conversation. I know I don't deserve it, but I think you're the only person who can push this town in the right direction. People listen to you. They respect you. They'll follow your lead if you're willing to step up. Daryl let out a bitter laugh. You're overestimating me, Bradley. People don't listen to me. Hell, half the town thinks I'm a traitor for saving your life. Bradley shook his head. That's not true. The media's made a mess of this, sure, But there are a lot of people, black and white, who see what you did for what it was. An act of courage. They're looking for someone to bridge the gap. Whether you like it or not, that someone might be you. Daryl felt the familiar weight return to his chest, the pressure of being thrust into a role he didn't want. He didn't want to be a hero or a leader. He just wanted to live his life, fix cars, and stay out of the spotlight. But the more Bradley talked, the more Daryl realized that maybe he didn't have a choice anymore. The town was changing. Whether it was for better or worse depended on what happened next, and like it or not, Daryl was at the center of it. "I don't know if I'm the right guy for this," Daryl said, his voice soft but steady. Bradley looked at him with a strange mix of hope and resignation. "Maybe not, but you're the one we've got." Later that night, long after Bradley had left the garage, Daryl sat on the steps outside his home, staring up at the stars.